Hello and welcome to Dev Game Club, a weekly podcast in which two veteran game developers play games from the past and talk about their impact and relevance today. I'm Tim Longo, and I'm joined as always by a man who is still wondering where all of those red orbs come from every time he checks in code.
Brett Duville. Hello, sir. Where
Hello.
do those red orbs come from?
I don't know.
I actually know where they come from. They come from Broderbund.
Wait, what? What reference?
That is a deep cut. So
that is a super deep cut.
Total aside, before we go into where red orbs come from,
get this out of the way.
That is Tom Clancy's studio was founded by Broderbund and was called Red Orb Entertainment.
Oh, that's ringing a bell. Okay.
And it was I think it was in North Carolina. I think that's where he lived.
Didn't it become Red Storm at some point?
Oh, that's actually, so Red Orb is another thing that was Broderbund because it was backwards. It was Broder. Now it's killing. I'm going to have to look it up.
Oh, you're saying you thought it was Red.
I thought it was Red Storm was that one, but no, it's, there was a Red Orb Entertainment. Yes, it was a publishing division.
Broderbund
Edutainment software. It was right up the road from us in Nevada. So I remember it.
That's why it rang a bell.
But they also published the Riven and Prince of Persia 3D.
Okay.
A couple of Journeyman Project games. Yeah. So they did they were basically meant to be edutainment, but then ended up doing basically no edutainment. It looks like
made money.
Yeah.
We're of course
good plan.
We're talking my red orb reference is we're talking about God of War 1, of course. So those who followed us on Twitter and such, we were indecisive at the last episode, so we weren't sure what we were going to play. But then with the timeliness of the semi-spiritual reboot with the new God of War, just called God of War, on the PS4, getting good buzz and getting good reviews and stuff, we thought it was a good time to go back to the original God of War, which had quite a big impact. But of course, my joke is just referring to red orbs coming from barrels and doors and
chests. Basically, red orbs are like the Force, Tim.
Yeah, they're midichlorians. Yeah. You got to have a midichlorian joke whenever you can get it. In fact, I heard one yesterday. So yeah, they're common. Well, so God of War, 2005, Brett and I were talking in pre-show, and we thought this was the latest game that we had played, and then we discovered and had forgotten that Shadow of the Colossus came out in 2005 as well. So both late PS2 games, and we definitely feel like one of the big topics we do need to talk about is not even necessarily as much about the releases for this year, but really the state of the console market in this year. So, I mean, you should mention your point about 360 and stuff, and maybe kind of the end of the cycle for PS2, we thought.
Right. Yeah. The common wisdom at this point, and there were business reasons being made for both consoles at this point. But generally speaking, at the end of a console lifecycle, you're not launching a new IP, although you can't really call God of War a new IP in the sense that it's based on Greek myth. So some people invented it a couple thousand years ago, but it is at least a new line of titles. It's not related to anything else that had been published before, and it was only the second title, I think, fully developed by Sony Santa Monica, which was then called Santa Monica Studios. Anyway, and they were actually in Santa Monica then. I don't think they are anymore, but they've kept their name.
That's funny. I didn't know that.
Yeah. So anyway, this is the year that the 360 was coming out, and that was essentially ushering in the next generation of consoles. Microsoft was trying to get a bit of a jump, but there was still a lot of life left in the PS2.
The install base alone was just for the PS2. We should have looked at it, but it was quite high.
I think it's around 110 million total worldwide for the PS2.
That's insane.
That's an astonishing number of units. I believe it may have had the highest install base of all time, other than the PC, obviously. Well, you never know.
It says 120 million consoles shipped.
Okay, so around this time it was around 100, but Lifetime it probably kept trickling on for a while because they came out with a slimline unit around this time, maybe even a little later, which was a lot cheaper, and that typically moves some units as well. So you would tend to see two things in this year. One is people trying to get their titles out because they don't want to have to release it after the console is dead. I'm putting that in air quotes. And then also maybe trying to pay off on some investments that have been being made. And when you're looking at an install base this high, those people are theoretically still going to play games. I mean, if there was a really good PS2 game out today, I'd probably buy it because I still have one, as people know and have watched me play games on stream. So anyway, the 360 did herald in a new era. The PS3 came along, I believe, a year later. It was definitely a little later to the party. They had to sort of rethink their graphics pipeline and what they had in mind for that. And that I think may have led to delays. But you saw a lot of really good end of life cycle titles starting to come out in 2005. And I'm thinking particularly, of course, of God of War, Shadow of Colossus, which we played, Dragon Quest VIII, which is gorgeous. And maybe someday I can convince you to play that, whether on the cast or not. And I had another one in mind, and there it goes.
Oh yeah, it wasn't. I was on. Resident Evil 4 came out this year, but not on PS2. But
no, it did on PS2 as well. It was later on the PS2. It was not simultaneous. It came out, I believe, in the fall.
It was in the same year, though.
It was in the same year.
Okay. Well, yeah, that's one then. I'm scanning again. Fear, but that was on Windows and 360. That was. Yeah, I think the interesting thing about this time for us, when I look back, I think all of us have because we were at least what we were doing around this time, though this was technically the year that I was not in the industry for that year.
That's right.
But from a development standpoint, people, we were closing down Republic Commando, of course, for those who may or may not know, shipped this year as well, and we. Developers are thinking about the next generation, right? They're thinking about the future. Most likely, many of the AAA developers already have the kits for the 360 and have been working with it for a while. So when we see a big game come out like God of War 2 or God of War and Shadow of the Colossus, it's always a little bit weird to us, even though, like Brett said, it's really not necessarily kind of a reality, the reality of things for us to think this way, because of course there's plenty of people out there that have the PS2 and want more PS2 games, but we're already thinking ahead. So when we see an awesome game come out, end of cycle, it always kind of is a head scratcher for us, because we think to ourselves, well, why didn't they just focus on, the thing that's about to come out, and kind of get some synergy going on there. But both Shadow of the Colossus and God of War were some great surprises, I think, for us as developers as well, because they, as we will talk about over this series with God of War, they both were showing you how it's done on a console that was pretty, you can speak to it better than I can, but pretty traditionally hard to develop for. And yes. I think the thing we've talked about various times on the podcast is late cycle in any console is when developers really grab a hold of how to develop for it. And, all the tricks of the trade and all the ways you can squeeze things out of the console that you couldn't early in the generation of that, in the life cycle of that console. And Metal Gear Solid 2 was an example of that. These two games where you're just like, you're playing these games and you can't believe that they were able to get this out of it, out of this console. So, God of War was definitely a surprise, and replaying it for this first episode was definitely, I was remembering some of those feelings of, wow, this is pretty impressive for this system.
Yeah. This one I was very surprised with back in the day when I played it, that they were getting this much out of the PS2. Now, of course, Shadow of the Colossus and Dragon Quest VIII, also Sly Cooper 3, which is another one I want to mention. Even though it's a sequel, it still looks amazing.
Guitar Hero was this year,
and Guitar Hero comes out late in this year. Grand Theft Auto San Andreas, I think, was the year before. I think that was in 2004. So these games that are late in the PS2 cycle, and just you're totally surprised by what they can do. And of course, these are all Sony exclusives, which is really a big deal. I think it's I don't know where that falls for people anymore in terms of what people think about that. But Sony Santa Monica is of course first party, and the others have Shadow of the Colossus was by Japan Studio. So those are basically Sony, not so much internal, but Sony studios, owned studios, and the other two are just sort of close friends of the family, you might say. They're not, but they only shipped for Sony platforms at that time. During that generation, as far as I recall. I may not be entirely correct on that, but I think that's true. So it's interesting how much you can squeeze out of the machine the more and more you know about it. I mean, even just going from Starfighter to Jedi Starfighter in basically a year, which means basically 10 months of development, we doubled performance on that engine.
That's a good data point.
Right, and we did that in a lot of ways, and of course the designers then just kind of threw more stuff in it, so it ended up playing just as slow. Like large ships and like with turrets all over them, and like just all these things.
You're welcome.
Yep, thank you. And honestly, a lot of that, if I were to reprogram that game today, I would get it twice as fast again. Yeah. I have no doubt of that. Even on the same hardware, just because I've learned a lot, and so has anybody who worked on that project in the last number of years. It's been a long time. So as you get late in these systems, you've just learned everything that hardware can do, whether it's, if I use this instruction before this instruction, the compiler doesn't usually generate that. It turns out that I have to hand write that, and it makes it go tons faster. Or I can do this, and it'll run really well on the VUs, which were these other parts of the hardware, or sort of specialized little vector units that did vector math really fast. And you just could get tons of benefit out of these machines the more you played with them. I think we're probably seeing that slow down to a degree because the hardware has become a little less specialized as we've gone on. I think the most recent generation of consoles are more like PCs. They're not exactly PCs, but they're more like the best PC you could put together for whatever, $400 when they came out. With some specialized hardware, no doubt, and they're probably taking a little bit of a loss on the hardware when they start. But so maybe push that needle up a little bit to like $500. Who knows what the number is? But they're basically PCs in terms of their architecture, and they're running kind of standard sort of software, Windows or Linux operating systems under the hood. Back then, in the sort of Xbox and even Xbox 360 and PS2 days, and then of course with the PS3 as well, you're not talking that kind of standardization at all, and you really had to figure stuff out. There are some fun, just as an aside, there are some fun games, sort of indie programming games, where you get these kind of weird fake hardware and you have to solve problems like, how many cycles can I solve this problem in? And that's what it was like, is figuring out, how can I get the most out of these things? So it was really kind of an interesting time, and it was endless. I feel like had we kept working on the PS2, we'd still be figuring out stuff. So it's just interesting, and that's part of the excitement. And you can sort of hear me get excited about programming.
Yeah, maybe we should make Starfighter 3 and see what we can do
on the PS2. Yeah,
on the PS2. That's what I mean. Some other notable games I wanted to mention: Devil May Cry 3 was out this year on PS2 as well. Pretty well regarded, one of the Devil May Cry games. Gran Turismo 4, I remember being a pretty big deal on the PS2 as well. And then just as far as like as a racing game on that system, people being pretty impressed. And then Splinter Cell Chaos Theory, which was arguably maybe the best Splinter Cell game, came out this year too, and that was on all platforms basically. But yeah, it was on PS2. So. You also mentioned Lego Star Wars, which I think is notable because of that sort of the legacy of that whole thing. But that was the first one that really started it off. But yeah, it It was an interesting year in weird ways, and especially for this platform. But I think your point about first party is a really interesting one, and I think it's also interesting in a full circle kind of way this year or last couple years for PlayStation, because they've been really killing it in that regard. And with God of War coming out, just now, and Horizon last year and stuff like that, they've really doubled down on that.
Yeah.
And of course, I have to be careful what I say, but I'm with what I do. But that's kudos to them for really focusing on that and killing it. And it reminds me a lot of the PS2 days in that way, right? Because PS2 was so dominant, and there were games that you really wanted to play on the system because they were exclusive. So yeah.
Yeah, no, that's definitely true. I mean, I think, yeah, you mentioned that's basically still a bit of a battle. And I mean, Nintendo's kind of off doing its own thing because they've got such long established properties. PlayStation tends to actually every cycle sort of generate new ones, and they kind of last and maybe overlap a little bit into the next gen from when they're introduced. So you've got Jack and Daxter and Ratchet and Clank, and then they kind of fade away. Ratchet and Clank actually went all the way through PS3 lifecycle, so that one just kept going. But you get these titles that kind of come in, they do what they do for a while on one generation, and then they kind of fade away. And occasionally, we're lucky enough to see them come back. And I'm actually pretty optimistic about the new God of War. Both because of the advanced buzz. I believe it comes out later this week. I certainly haven't played any of it. But also because that team has been working with that franchise for a long time, and they know it inside out, and probably found some interesting new things to do. I mean, I want to sort of segue and say, like, working on an IP for a long time is a lot like working on hardware for a long time. You have to find new ways to get something out of it. And I think that's what's happening with the new one. I don't know if we'll play that at the end of this or not. I'd like to. We'll see. But yeah, it's kind of fascinating how that parallel exists.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, there's some similarities, I would say. I guess in my head, I would imagine there are similarities to the Tomb Raider stuff that we were talking about early in that reboot's history.
Oh, I bet. Yeah.
And what do you do next? And we went full reboot, and it sounds like they've done a clever job of kind of like I said earlier, spiritually rebooting. So it's still technically connected to the previous games, but it's very much a different thing. It sounds like in a good way. So. Yeah, and you got to mix it up. You definitely got to try to mix it up when you get when you have that that franchise kind of long on the tooth. And going back to sort of God of War 1 as we're playing, the one of the things I wanted to mention up top, and maybe we can just start getting into it on some of the
let's do.
But it's definitely a game of its time, is how I put the note down, and you probably know what I mean by that, but to explain myself further, it's just when I see some of the videos for the new game compared to this one, you can see the tonal shift and just how it carries itself and how it takes itself seriously or what have you. And this one is just so I don't know, juvenile. Yeah. I just think it was an era where, and that's why, again, I think why Shadows of the Colossus stood out this year, because it was not like that at all, and we've talked about that ad nauseum with the other series we did on those. So you can go back and listen to those, but for Eco and Shadows, but it just stood out. Right. And it's not that God of War isn't a wonderful game in many ways, but for me, I remember that, I was remembering my frame of mind at the time playing it when it came out, because it's just not my thing, tonally. And I usually bounce off of things that are kind of in that juvenile area. And as we've probably talked about on the podcast, as another example with GTA, I have a hard time with, so I don't know how we're going to eventually play that one. But we probably will have to, and I'll have to just buck up. But I had forgotten about sort of how they handle the character and how for Kratos and how to the hilt, no pun intended, they go with some of the decisions they make with how he deals with the world and how the world deals with him and his persona, and it just it's just not my favorite. So I just wanted to mention that up front so we can get it out of the way because, he's an anti-hero that really, does he have any redeeming qualities so far? And, doesn't seem to, but.
Yeah, so I mean, what I would say about that, and I think that this carries through to the latest game, is that Kratos is working in Greek mythology, and I actually think his tone is pretty true. Maybe not to reading the Iliad. Well, maybe reading the Iliad, actually, now that I think about it. Not so much the Odyssey, which has a lot more complexity. But this is old Greek myth type stuff, and it's big and it's bombastic. It's unapologetic. It's sexist as hell. And it's Clash of the Titans too, the old one, not the remake. Yeah. Whereas they've now shifted to Norse mythology, which was always darker.
Yeah.
It is a dark mythology. I played Senua's Sacrifice, Hellblade Senua's Sacrifice this week, and that is so dark. And they tell the stories from the mythology, and I'm like, oh my goodness, I knew some of this stuff, but I didn't really know a lot of these stories, and I forgot that the Wagner's Ring cycle came from Norse myth, but I knew some of that story, and I thought, wow, that's right. The Norse stuff is really, really tough. It's probably because they lived in snow instead of the Mediterranean. Anyway, I think it reflects both what the ancient myth it comes from, but also the sort of 80s representations of that myth.
I think it's fair that Greek myths were kind of on a foundational level not great when it comes to how they handled things because of their era, of course, right? And there was no politically correct and et cetera, right? But I don't want to give them a pass on, even separate from that. I feel like there's still, because there's also other Greek myth influenced things that have been, medias that have been mediums that have taken those myths and done different things with them and done them in I guess I would say respectful or maybe even modernized ways, being a theater geek myself. And so it's not impossible. I think it's fair that there's a connection point there that matches because of the melodrama of those Greek myths and how ridiculous they were. So I think that's a good point. I didn't think about that, but I still think there's certain things you can see and even in whatever the dialogue or what have you, you can see that they were intentionally being what they were, they were intentionally going after this certain thing with him because, they just wanted to be that edgy, that edgy version of this character that you couldn't believe they had the balls to go after, you know what I mean? And to do the things that they did. It's like, oh, we're kind of going over the top to be controversial or something, but anyway, that's a fair. Also, that's fair. It matches.
I think also embracing. Yeah, I mean, you think of like, what is it, Jason and Medea, and
totally. I'm with you.
Yeah. So I mean, I get it. I think it, if you've read that stuff, you sort of get a sense of like, oh, I could see where this comes from. I maybe wouldn't have taken it in this direction, but that's not the same as it's impossible to see how they got here. So
sure. Yep.
So, I mean, I don't totally give them a pass by any means, because I do feel it is pretty juvenile a lot of the time. But I think part of that sets up the big story beats that happen towards the end. They make it a tale of a fatal flaw, and that's a huge thing in Greek tragedy. So it feels rooted, at least in the tradition, in many ways. Maybe some stuff it leans into a little more than I'd like. So
no, it's fair. And I mean, to that point, one of the things that I'll hit next is just starting off with the opening of the game. and something that I did always appreciate about some of the boldness of their decisions of how they're going to, because this is essentially a over the top action brawler, game.
Right.
And so they're having fun with it, right? They're definitely making one of those games, even though sometimes I think they do take themselves too seriously in that regard. But so it's this weird hybrid of that. But I definitely always appreciated this sort of opening of the game with him standing on that precipice and some narration, and then he, essentially commits suicide. And it's definitely memorable, packs a punch. You want to know what's going to happen, and you can't believe that they were that bold with that opening. And so you're just gonna you're in for it. You're just along for the ride and ready to take the roller coaster. And then the first level alone sets the bar of like, wow, what is this game? They're just they're just doing everything. And the other note I wrote down is the number of verbs in just that first level that you have, the number of things that you do, all custom. I mean, this is a customly built game, handcrafted moment to moment, like in an extreme way. There are very few, other than the animation system and the AI systems, there are very few, systemic elements. Right. So and that was what its thing was, so, the opening was always, it stuck with me as pretty bold and cool.
It's one of those openings that whenever you do an opening where something dramatic happens and then you fall back and you're going to play up to the point that happened. I mean, it's like Uncharted 2 does that extremely well. I don't remember if which of the other Uncharted do that. I feel like another one maybe does. But whenever you do that, to have that moment of like, all right, hold on. Let me explain how I got here. Is a great sort of moment. It's a terrific thing because you immediately have this mystery of whoa, how are we going to get to that? That's a big step, literally in this case. And the other thing that I appreciated that another mystery is set up very soon thereafter, which is when you go and you interact with some guy in a cage and he's like, no, don't come closer. I know who you are. Yeah. Don't get near me. I'd rather die than be saved by you. Yeah, and that's a pretty dramatic statement. So then again, you've got this huge level of mystery of like, okay, not only is this guy going to go and jump off a cliff, but also no one wants to be near this guy. Yeah. So who the heck is he? And I love that double mystery of both character and fate, that which are really kind of two underpinning themes often in Greek tragedy, that are coming right into the fore here in the first 5 minutes of this game, which is terrific.
Well, and I think what's more, which is, I feel like we've talked about this with another one, but I can't think of what game it was. But there is an era of anti-heroism being kind of upon us around this time, I feel like. And Kratos is like the ultimate example, because to your point about that guy in the cage, like he responds to you as the ghost of Sparta and blah, blah, blah. But then, you're playing as this character that everyone hates, and so this concept of being that dark hero and how are you gonna, is this a redemption story, or like why am I the hero if I'm playing as this guy that nobody wants to be, or wants to, wants to be around? So there's an interesting tension between, I would say, the player and the character too. So yeah, that's a cool point as well. And they just start breadcrumbing in a bunch of different little things in the opening where you meet each of the gods as they give you things, and kind of the way they react to you, and you're just piecing this together. And so it's definitely pulling you forward, because you want to get the next breadcrumb, if you will, or something like that. So, it's a cool opening. And I mean, one little other tidbit I wanted to mention of the opening in my notes of just there's something that I'd forgotten about, but definitely came back to me once I started playing again, is this, I guess I don't want to call it. It's not as far as like sort of a schizophrenic pacing, but you definitely you felt that probably during development they felt like they needed to have some good ebb and flow to the pacing, and so they needed some downtimes, and so they added in some verbs like balancing on beams.
Oh boy.
And things where you're like, what the heck is this here for? You're this complete badass just doing crazy stuff, and then you can't get across this beam.
Yeah, I have to tell you,
doing double jumps
balancing on a beam is a mechanic in video games that I hope will die a fiery death forever, because I always hate it. I cannot remember a game where I've been like, oh, what a great fun time I've had balancing across this thing as this superhero. It was also a bit in Senua's Sacrifice, so it's fresh on my mind. And I mentioned in a Slack that it should die 1,000 deaths, because it isn't, and it was one of my biggest complaints about this game at the time, and it gets worse. I mean, late in the game,
level.
Late in the game, there's stuff that are awful.
I'm not looking forward to that.
Yeah, no, I'm not looking forward to coming back to that. I mean, it's coming back, and I'm just getting better at it pretty quickly. But yeah, I'm this superhero. Oh my god, let me tiptoe across this board,
and then I fall into the water, which and then you're swimming, and you're like it's such a funny, I can understand the motivation from a game development and game design perspective to do that kind of stuff. That's why I mentioned the pacing, right?
Right.
You want that ebb and flow. You don't want it to just be at 11 the whole time, because, then
otherwise 11 starts to feel like 5, right?
Yep,
I mean, it just does.
Trust me, I've made those mistakes myself. So I'm definitely not innocent of that. But so I feel it. But at the same time, if you go too far in the wrong direction with some of these downbeats, especially if you add in a verb like balancing on a beam, the dissonance you're going to feel with the character, in this case, who is literally a superhero, you're just like, what the heck is... Yep, here come the dogs. Apologize, audience. They're out unattended. Who knows what they're going to do? And I forgot all about it until there's that. And I think not only had I forgotten about it, that it was even in the first level, but I was actually stuck for a second, because I got there, and I think mentally I was thinking, wait a second, they're not going to make me walk across this beam, are they?
Right.
And because I couldn't believe, because this is a high impact, high energy section, of course, right? This isn't like a super puzzle. So they're kind of, I guess you could argue that they're probably training you on that mechanic, but I don't know. It's just so out of place and weird. And
yeah, I almost feel like some kind of, and actually one comes pretty soon after, so sort of a positioning puzzle with that block you have to push across a field of arrows. Sort of comes sooner, and I think they are basically trotting out like, here's the stuff you're going to do. And of course, we're going to have to get to the other major mechanic, which is the quick time events, which was fairly new at the time.
They helped.
I think this popularized it. Yeah, they were.
This popularized. Shenmue gets the credit for the first one.
Oh, that's true. Yeah. No, I'm not saying at all that they were the first. I just feel like they're the ones that were like, well, if you're gonna do them, let's make it something like this.
Yeah, I would say they perfected them, right? And everyone copied them after this, for sure.
Right.
This is
to death.
Yeah. To death, and also a little guilty of that myself. So full disclosure. The quick time events. What was I going to say? Oh, go ahead. Oh no, I wanted to shift topics, but maybe you were.
Yeah. Well, so no, I liked what you were saying though, but I feel like they're saying like, okay, here's this first level. It is a microcosm of the whole game.
Yeah.
You're going to fight some, and then you're going to do this stupid dawdling over these bars thing. And then,
whoa. Like his animations are great. They're really spot on, like, but he's still
literally tiptoeing it. Oh, it's so ridiculous.
Like the God of War. So
yeah.
I guess
the God of Worry.
Not yet, but yeah.
And then it's like, and then you're going to do some kind of positional thing where you're going to manipulate the environment, and then you're going to fight some more, and then you're going to have a boss. and it's going to have these quick time events, and maybe some special mechanic. So it feels like that is basically the game writ large. That is what each section is going to be, but it's also what the whole thing is going to be. So
yeah, it's interesting. It's an interesting, microcosmic design. Yeah, I hope we get someone on to talk about it, because it'd be interesting to hear about what their first playable was, or like what was the first level, their prototype, or how they kind of developed for that, because the game has, like you said, a formula / template, and they just kind of mix and match those sort of modular components in different ways through the level design. And we'll have to talk about camera. Maybe we won't have time today, but that's a significant part of this game's impact, in my opinion, is what they did with camera. So we would talk about it for years to come. The subject.
I would look in the extras as an aside, because I believe in the extras there is a video of their early prototypes.
Oh, okay, all right, cool.
So we should totally check that out, and we can talk about it next time.
Okay, that's good. I didn't know that. I was just going to ask you a question, actually, shift gears a little bit, and I'll answer mine really quick. But my answer to my own question. But the interesting thing for me with this game, because I remember talking about it back in the day too, as a developer, and debating it, because, like I said, the audience may not know, but I had taken a year off, and then when I went back to the industry, I started at Crystal, and so obviously God of War would come up from time to time for many different reasons. But it's an interesting game to me, because I've always had a little bit of trouble finding what its influences were, because it's such an interesting hybrid of things, because of its camera work, because of its action, but also it has puzzles and some of these navigational things, and it's such a weird mixture of things. And so, like, even Soul Reaver comes to mind, Tomb Raider comes to mind, Devil May Cry maybe, but also like some of the old like 2D beat 'em ups, brawlers, maybe even Castlevania comes to mind with some.
I was thinking Maximo, Ghosts and Goblins.
Ghosts and Goblins. Yeah, that's a good catch. So I kind of wanted to ask you, like, what you like. Maybe we'll get to ask somebody this, but when it comes to, like, early in development, you tend to sort of talk to each other about, like, this, this kind of like this game and this game merged with this game, and I'm kind of interested to know which games they would say, when they were talking about the game. But Ghosts and Goblins, anything else come to mind?
I had one there, and now it's just Medieval. I don't know if you've ever played those.
They're remastering
they're remastering that. That might be a PlayStation 1 that would be fun to kind of go back to, because I did really like the sort of humor and everything there. I mean, I think that it feels to me like they're picking from the best stuff of a bunch of games rather than trying to emulate any one game.
Yeah, that's what I mean, though.
I don't know that I could say what their lineage is, because there's also a very light, and I stress extremely light, RPG element to it, which I don't think we'll talk about this time, because I have a whole conversation I want to have about that.
Okay. Yeah.
But I feel and they grafted that on top. It feels like they sort of skimmed the top of a number of genres, like platformers, and
there's platforming as well, and double jumping, and that's kind of my point. Is I remember talking about it back in the day, and I think it had always come up as this interesting, hybridization of multiple. I love the skimming off the top of a bunch of different games, because the irony of that is, it itself was copied many times and is still copied, since then, because it was this interesting merging of all of these kind of best ofs. It's kind of a best of genre game, with this high production value, and it does definitely work. But as the developer in me, it really freaks my brain out, because I tend to like to put things in boxes, and I never was able to really fully do that with this game.
Yeah, I think that something we've talked about with like pure adventure games is that you don't have really you don't have systems, you have lots of one-offs. Yeah. And here you have very much a systemic combat and sort of the RPG elements that support it. But aside from that, you have lots of level design, and individual boss fights and things like that, which are very much, I mean, that's even Zelda, right?
Sure.
That's I mean, I'm sure they're taking some from Ocarina of Time as well. So I think you definitely see those all as sort of individual influences. It's just nobody had put anything kind of like this together before.
Mm-hmm.
I think that System Shock 2, although not nearly as pacey, as fast paced as far as the
It's
combat
a good hybrid
and things like that. Yeah. But it is another hybrid that feels like it also takes lots of elements from a bunch of different things and maybe glues this kind of GURPS like role playing system around it. So I mean, it just feels like skimming the top of everything and apparently the playground balance beam, which is not the best of anything as far as I can tell. But maybe it was because the Olympics were the year before. I don't know.
And if anyone wants to hear us talk about System Shock 2, we are first
go all the way back.
All the way back, and we
is still available on iTunes. I had to extend that out to a couple hundred episodes recently, but it's still available.
Nice. Yeah, don't lose that. You got Ken on there, and
it's classic. Well, at some point, we'll have to like put them back in so that they reappear. But anyway, we digress.
So we should hit camera next time for sure. I think the other thing I want to talk about is just sort of the over the top presentation and grandness of the game. And you want to talk about the RPG, light RPG stuff, and
absolutely. One thing I think we can touch on very briefly, and I'm kind of curious from a design standpoint how you feel about this. It felt pretty natural to me, but there's basically two types of tutorialization going on in this opening section, and we probably won't come back to this, which is why I want to kind of bring it up quickly. There's both explicit and non-explicit tutorialization. So explicitly, I mean, they put literally on the screen, like, do this to have this happen, with a message that you have to, hand dismiss. Mm-hmm. And then the non-explicit or implicit is things like, oh, there's a barrier here that is made out of wood that you can break through, and it gives you those red orbs that we were talking about at the top, which sort of implicitly is like, oh, I can't go anywhere. Let me break through this. Oh, look at that. I got some of that. So maybe I should destroy everything I possibly can in the environment. So there's basically both of those going on. I feel like that's more the style these days, the latter. But I'm curious, like what you have to say about it and how it felt to you.
Yeah, I mean, I talk about a sort of not necessarily another schizophrenic aspect, but a hybrid aspect where I think it's a great point, because I totally love those teaching you before you know it kind of moments like that. And they have a great, because of the orbs in general, red, green, or blue, they have a great way to teach you and to positively reflect your actions. So they could have done more of that. And it kind of, when those first tutorial, because the thing is like I'm still guilty of that today myself, because it's always a hard problem to solve. It's always, it takes a lot of level design iteration and a lot of flow iteration to figure out a way to do that without those pop-ups. But games still do it today, unfortunately. And again, I'm to blame. We did it in Republic Commando as well, and they're just jarring. It's not the way you should do it. And so I didn't even think about your point that they actually do both. And I just, you just always, for me at least, from a design perspective, I always wish that people would take that next extra step. I wish I would take that next extra step on games that we work on to really like make that. I mean, essentially Nintendo's the best at it as far as I can tell, right? Like we've talked about that before, probably. It's like, that's just the systems and the way that the world and the levels are built. They're just thinking about this in every aspect. And we know that they go through a lot of iteration to get there for sure. But they also do, I think, a good job planning that out. And that's just the right way to do it. And we just need to keep learning from them more and more.
Yeah, no, that's a fair point. Yeah, in games that have lots of combos, I feel like it's unavoidable really to have to sort of explain to you, oh, do this to have this happen. I feel like there's even some of that in Super Mario 64 in order to teach you some of the crazier jumps.
Maybe so. The funny thing, though, that now that you are bringing this topic up that I'm thinking of and didn't even dawn on me, the funny thing about that is they actually, because of the QTEs, they already have kind of a mechanical way to introduce you to what buttons do. So do they, yes, they have combos, and yes, they can get complicated, and there's some almost fighting game elements that down the road when you get really powered up, because there's a lot of different button combos you can do, or maybe Devil May Cry kind of stuff. But when it comes to like the fact that, say, pressing the circle is a hold or a grab or whatever it is, they could have popped that up as a QTE and then just shown you doing it. And then, you know what I mean? Like there could have been ways that they could have integrated it a little bit better. Then you also would have been teaching them the QTEs at the same time or something. I mean, they pop the buttons up anyway for the most part.
Yeah.
So, yeah. I don't know. It's fair. It's just that kind of that designer's instinct to want to explain things or over-explain things. I think we need to fight that usually, because the players are smarter than we think, you know.
Yeah, they're smarter than we think, and also they don't read. So
yeah, right. And they're irritated when we stop them and make them read.
Well, the same. I mean, it happened to me. I was playing a game today, and I went totally blithely over something, and I was like, "Oh, I think I needed to know something there." It took me a little while to figure out what they had been trying to tell me. And I ultimately figured it out, but it took me a little while, and I was like, oh, I wish I had been given a little bit, I don't know, gentler instruction. I don't know. I mean, those kind of harsh popping up a thing and stopping your flow stuff is kind of weird here,
especially in an action game like this. You know?
Yeah. I mean, at the very beginning, there's a lot of punctuation of like, oh, I do all this combat. Oh, and then I stop, and look, there's a door. So.
Yeah, that's fair.
It feels like they already take some breaks, but yeah, it is kind of weird and definitely feels older school. But I thought it was worth bringing it up because we probably won't have another chance.
There's some great moments in this first section too. Before we move on, just to mention them. I mean, some of the sort of surprising things. I think the Hydra integration throughout the whole level is great. You meet it multiple times, and then the kind of crescendo, and then going inside of it.
Yeah, I love that. I love that moment.
It really comes back to
the guy's complaining. He's like, "Help!
Yeah, and that's a perfect moment for what kind of character Kratos is, right? You know what you're getting yourself into when he just lets that guy fall. But it kind of your earlier point about how mythological this game is. It's interesting. For me to think about that now, because you know that's the kinds of like going inside the Hydra,
right?
is very mythological in that way of like that. You know, that's what those heroes, those classical heroes would do things,
right? Or even the gods, right? When the Titan swallows all his children and all that stuff.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, it's totally like. You never really have a sense reading that stuff. It's a little dry, and you don't get a sense of the scale and things like that, of how big something would have to be to have 7 heads or whatever. And here it embraces all that and even pushes it further, I think, than you would naturally think to go. So,
yeah, this seems like a game like I think some of the best games are usually, maybe we've talked about this before, but usually those ones where you can see. It's sort of this admired quote, you know, of games built on series of interesting decisions. But you can, for me at least as a developer, I feel like really good games, you can kind of see where they answered no to certain things and where they answered yes to certain things to make up the sort of combination of what the game ultimately becomes. And this game feels like just a series of yeses. They just was like, well, should we do this? Yeah, let's do that. And then we'll go inside the Hydra, and then we'll, you know, it's just like they just kept saying yes to everything. It feels like, and that's kind of the persona of the game. It's like it's just this crazy over the top, you know, just fantasy fulfillment.
And I mean, you're saying that, and I'm thinking that's what Half-Life was like.
Saying yes, yeah, that's true. And as Dario talked about, right, they kind of were one-upping each other. Exactly. As well. Yeah. So yeah, that's good. That's a good point. I do think they had an economy of decisions though too, and some of the things they chose. not to do, because it wasn't like a high action game,
Right.
Half-Life, but it was, it was a smart, like you could play in a smart way. I don't know. Maybe you can in this game, but I feel it's pretty button mashy.
Yeah, it's fairly button mashy. I would not.
I think I've heard if you play on hard, which I definitely am not doing, that it's definitely a whole different game. But that's not for me.
Yeah, that's how I played it originally.
On hard.
Yeah. When I played it when it came out, I played it on hard, and then I started on very hard. And I was like, nope, no, I've had enough. Thank you. I'm slapping the mat here.
Yeah.
Why don't we take a quick break?
Yeah.
So I can rest from that, and we'll come back and talk feedback.
Okay.
Welcome back from the break. It's the latter half of the show. We like to talk a little bit of feedback. Naturally, we're getting more feedback right now about adventure games and such. Although, actually, this time I think we only have one about the Sierra series we just completed, and a couple others that are sort of general. You can send email to devgameclub@gmail.com. And of course, although we don't have any to read this time, we'd love to have your reviews on Apple Podcasts. That's just terrific. It really helps increase our visibility. And, if you've already done that, if you want to share it with a friend, that would be splendid as well. So thanks very much for that in advance. Hello, sir. Can you go ahead and give us the first email?
It's just terrific. I love that you say terrific. I don't know why, but it's like, I feel like it's an old man thing. I love it. It's terrific.
How much older? I'm like...
like months. I don't
6
know.
months older than you? I have no idea, but it's not a lot.
It's just terrific. I don't know why that cracks me up. Anyway, okay. Our first email subject: adventure games and Germany, from Sebastian Pellegrino. I will say.
I think that's right now.
Hi, Brett and Tim. As Tim Schafer once said, quote, these days, it seems like adventure games are almost a bit of a lost art form. They exist in our dreams, in our memories, and in Germany, end quote. I remember that. It's a bit of a hyperbole comment, but not false. Point and click adventures are one of my favorite genres. I have much love for LucasArts ones. I have much more love for LucasArts ones than Sierra, but nonetheless, the last couple of podcasts has been so much fun. In the last one, you talked about the more contemporaneous ones. Who he threw me for a loop on that one.
Actually, I did that.
You son of? Are you serious?
I had to. His English was not great, so I had to try to capture what he was trying to say.
And you chose, okay.
Contemporaneous.
Yeah.
I could have said contemporary, but contemporaneous was just.
And now I see what's going to happen here. Yeah. Now I see this is my life and my future. Okay, like the ones from Telltale, Double Fine, Aminata, and Watch it. I think that's
Watch it.
There are a lot of great ones from different developers, but I was really surprised that you didn't mention any games from Daedalic. Daedalic, yeah. From Germany. They have made a lot of great adventures like Edna and Harvey, the Deponia Saga, The Dark Eye, and The Whispered World. I just wanted you to acknowledge its existence, but if you weren't aware of these games, give them a look. Some have similar sense of humor to Monkey Island. Love the podcast. Keep up the great work, Sebastian. Buenos Aires in Argentina. I have to admit, I don't know that company. That's my bad.
I didn't know the company. I did know Deponia, and it didn't occur to me. I just didn't think of it. I think that's sort of an animated adventure game, very similar in look to a Scum game. Maybe a little bit, more modernized, more I don't even know what to say, but just higher resolution basically. But yeah, those sorts of like characters that move around. That's what I recall. Yeah, it definitely didn't come to mind. Although we should have mentioned at least that adventure games probably were kept alive in Germany for a number of years. Yeah,
that's a really good point.
Because I know both Hal Barwood and Bill Tiller were both doing either work that was mostly supported by German audiences or were consulting for people who were doing work for German audiences. So those are old LucasArts hands, and it didn't occur to me at the time, but that's definitely the case. And I appreciate having Sebastian write in to remind us, because I did totally in the moment not think of it and not think of Deponia. I haven't played much. I think I only have one of them, and I haven't played a lot of it, but it's definitely recognizably sort of a LucasArts style adventure game, and I should have.
Yeah, look at that. I mean, I don't know what the subject matter of the Dark Eye and the Whispered World are, but that sounds up my alley. So
yeah, it does. It's true. Yeah.
And as a quick anecdote, for those who don't know, Bill Tiller actually is still kind of as an indie developer, along with some of our other pals, still kind of doing some. If you like Curse of Monkey Island, is still sort of in that style. So he's still at it in the adventure game space, trying to make it work in the indie. So.
Yeah, I was gonna actually mention their game, which was called Duke Grabowski, Mighty Swashbuckler.
Right. Yes.
Definitely a very LucasArts inspired sort of adventure with Trials of 3 and things like that. A fun little thing. I think it was made in Unity, and it's good. It's fun. I played it all the way through. It's not super long, and the puzzles are probably not as challenging as the old games, but I don't think that's a bad thing in today's pace of games. So. Yeah, but definitely Bill did work. He did that Vampire's Tale as well, I think. I think that's what it was called.
He's been off and on kind of, really trying to make that happen. It's definitely one of his loves. And for those who don't know, Bill Tiller was, I don't know if he was, essentially, I think he was lead artist on Curse of Monkey Island. That art style is very much his style. So if you like that, and
right. I think you're right about. Yeah, I think you're right about that. He definitely worked on a ton of stuff. Yeah, he was the lead background artist on Curse of Monkey Island, and lead artist on Infernal Machine, which you should know. And he was also lead artist on The Dig. So he definitely has the whole heritage there, and carries it with him. So I'll take the second email. It is from Kyle Vermees, if that is your real name. Some questions, he says. Hey, Brett and Tim. First, let me say how much I enjoy the podcast. I enjoyed it immensely. I only discovered it about a month ago, but have already listened through several series of games that you've been going through. I'm hoping to play through some of the games you've done, will do, but so far have just listened to games that I've already played. System Shock 2, Fallout, Planescape Torment. I managed to track down a copy of Link to the Past, so I'll be playing through that and listening to your episodes on that when I get a chance. Excuse me. I was also excited to see you starting to play through some Sierra classics. I was raised on those games, and just the thought of the Sierra text parser fills me with love and dread in equal measure still to this day. Not sure if you have any plans to play through Manhunter or its sequel, which were Sierra games with more of a point-and-click type interface. They were definitely a different breed of game. I haven't seen the like of since. I remember being particularly frustrated upon discovering that after spending hours trying to figure out how to progress to the next day in Manhunter 2, you actually had to die in a particular way in order for the next day to come. That being said, I probably shouldn't have been playing games of that nature when I was 8 or 9 years old. Maybe not Manhunter, I guess. Yeah, I haven't actually played those games, but I can just imagine. Anyway, I came across your podcast after searching for game dev resources. I've been in enterprise software development, I'm a programmer, in Australia for 15 plus years, and I'm really excited about the possibility of working on developing an indie game. Obviously, there was a lot to learn in a lot of different spaces for me. I expect I'll be able to pick up the programming fairly easily with sufficient time. And while the art, music, and sound aspects will take longer, I'm sure there will be lots of resources for that online. I was wondering if, given your experience in the field, there were any books or other resources that you would recommend taking a look at, particularly regarding design, gameplay mechanics, level design, etc. I see a lot of books out there, but being new to the field, I don't know who the go-to guys are. Thanks for any help or advice you can offer, and keep up the great work you guys are doing. It's not often people want to put effort back into helping out others in their field and community, so it's great to see you guys doing it. I'm sure, like me, there are lots of other people that appreciate it too. Thanks, Kyle. Thanks, mate.
Yeah.
I threw that out there because of Australia.
That was just terrific. That was terrific.
Thank you. I knew you were going to say that. So one of the things we have to confess is that we're not big readers of game design books because when we came up, there really weren't any. And so what we did instead was played games. So it's hard to specifically recommend things that helped us.
Yeah, that helped us specifically though. So since then, a lot of, I think, either our contemporaries or as the industry has evolved, and we've talked about, different universities and colleges taking on this sort of mantle, more have definitely been written. So, I mean, we talked at break about Eric Zimmerman's Rules of Play being one that comes up quite a bit.
Yeah, I have to get her name too because it's too.
Oh, that's right. It's both authors. Yep, I apologize for that.
Yep, something like that. We know Zimmerman because he's a game designer that we know well. I'm looking it up. Go ahead.
Yeah, that's the one. And then what was
Katie Salen? I knew I was pretty close.
Yeah,
Katie
I apologize
Salen.
to Katie for that. Yeah, that's my bad. But and then Raf Koster has one. What was the title of that one though?
That's a theory of fun.
Yeah,
for game design.
Those tend to be ones that people recommend for just kind of the general framework of things. Another one that I mentioned to Brett that he's read as well. I've read a long time ago, but Hal Barwood had recommended it to me back in the day. And again, this was an era when there really weren't a lot of game design specific books. Was just an overall sort of design and aesthetics book called The Design of Everyday Things. Because, I think the thing that I definitely maybe mentioned on the podcast before, but often bug my wife with is kind of personally my infatuation of design of everyday things around me. A parking lot that is poorly designed from a level design perspective and flow, where,
right.
There's, even though it is game design specific stuff, I still think there's a lot you can learn just from the world around you when it comes to good and bad design. So that's an interesting book maybe to pull out that isn't just specifically about game design. But you had some others.
That's a great book. I mean, and it's by Don Norman. That's a terrific book, and the cover is kind of iconic. It's got this teapot where the handle and the spout are on the same side. It's a terrific image where you're like, oh yeah, somebody had to figure that out, not to do that.
Or doorknobs is the other.
Yeah, doorknobs is one.
Where it's like, yeah, there's some bad doorknobs out there. Yeah. I don't know who tested those.
Talks about doorknobs, or door, opening doors basically, and the questions that go into that. I mean, there's a million sort of resources. I certainly read Gama Sutra pretty regularly, and that's stuff. I mean, there's always something there that's new.
Yeah, that's a great catch because I read that every morning, and it is just chock full of stuff.
Yeah, there's often blogs there, and it depends, but there's a million sort of topics in game design, and you might just find stuff there that floats your boat. So that's kind of a steady stream of free content that you can kind of look for. And then there's a million, you can go out and look for your favorite designers or people who talk about games that you enjoy and maybe pick them apart. There's still a tradition of blogging about that stuff. So you can go out and try to hunt that stuff down. I can't give you any specific pointers. The other games I had, other books I had in mind were Brenda Romero's, I think it's Challenges for Game Designers, which is sort of literally that. It's a book full of like, hey, design a game that does this. It's not limited to video game design, but it certainly applies. Brenda's been in the industry for a million years. No, that's unkind to Brenda, but she's been in the industry. Since I think 1980, I believe, something like that. She worked on Wizardry 1 as a tester.
Yeah.
But she started when she was still, I believe, in high school. So her book I really enjoy. And then I also had a general one that Will Wright refers to because it influenced him so much in thinking about The Sims and SimCity, I believe. And that is A Pattern Language by Christopher Alexander. It's a book about architecture and how spaces function. And I think that that's kind of useful for level design. And actually, while we're talking about level design, I can't remember his real name, but his name on the internet is Radiator Yang. Does great analyses of level design and how you construct levels and what sort of concerns come into play in level geometry. Often looking at games that we've talked about, like Half-Life or things like that he can sort of pull apart and even look at how they work in the editor if they're on the PC. So you can track him down. Just so you're aware, he also does some sort of off the beaten path sorts of games that deal with adult issues. So just be aware that you might get that thrown in the mix when you look for him. Those are good games too, but I particularly recommend his level design work. Those are the things I can think that we could sort of think of. I don't know that I read enough design books, and of course I'm not a practicing designer. So it's when we were coming up, it was really a big conversation amongst members of the team of like, well, we should do this. This other game did this. Why don't we do that? And think about how that all fit together. So,
yeah. Yeah, it's a good question. Good luck with things, sir. I'm excited for you to kind of start getting started on stuff that you're passionate about. I love to hear how it goes. Keep us posted.
Cool. All right, you have the final email, which is short, although the answer, I have to get my phone out so I can answer it. Go.
Okay. Podcasts is the subject from Ryan. I'm not sure that's his real name. Hey, Brett and Tim. Hope you guys are doing well. Thank you, sir. I am doing well. Brett is not. I'm looking for some recommendations. A guy with an hour-plus commute for work. I am always looking for more podcasts/shows to get into. The reason I initially started listening and have often heard from people emailing is that we found you because of Jason and Kirk talking about DGC on split screen. I was wondering. Yeah. I actually maybe forgot that or didn't know that they mentioned us, so that's nice.
Are you kidding? They mentioned the Final Fantasy IX, and we got a million listeners.
I
Kotaku split screen.
Yeah. No, I keep forgetting that's the name of their podcast. People just say Kotaku podcast to me, and then I was like, I forget that theirs is called Split Screen. I thought that was something else. And then I was wondering if there is this last sentence here is I was wondering if there are any podcasts that you guys recommend, not limited to gaming. Thanks so much for doing the cast, Ryan.
I feel like listen to more gaming podcasts than I do.
Only listen to gaming podcasts. I used to listen to a lot of NPR back in the day, but to be honest, I got depressed most of the time, so I stopped. I can be quick because I only listen to gaming podcasts for whatever reason. That's kind of how I keep up to speed on things, and the ones I listen to are generally all journalists basically, and people out in the field, influencers. So I listen to Giant Bomb and Giant Beast Cast. Those are wonderful. Both casts are great and charismatic. And, again, I listen to them for purposes of keeping up on things, because I don't have the time to really be cutting edge and play everything. So if that's not what you're looking for, it's journalists talking about what they're doing. And so, but they're also entertaining. And news and things like that. But it's also just good. I like listening to people on podcasts talk about games, journalists in that fashion, because it's not editorialized, right? It's just their raw reactions, which I find often more valuable than something that is super curated or super, editorialized. So, and then the other two I listen to is a DLC with Jeff Kanata and Christian Spicer, and then Rebel FM. which is sort of one of the inspirations for this podcast, because they used to do a game club series for every so often, which they don't do anymore. But so those are my 4. What about you?
Let's see. Well, I listened to a lot more than 4, so I'm going to try to narrow it down. In terms of games, I do really enjoy the Waypoint Radio podcast, which is from the folks at Waypoint Advice. So that's like Patrick Klepek, Daniel Riendo, and of course, editor-in-chief Austin Walker, as well as others.
Yeah, so that's those two guys in particular are great. Yeah.
They do a lot of really good work, and it's worth seeking out their work. Steve Gaynor is actually in his 2nd season of Tone Control, which is a designer talking with designers. It's usually a limited run of, I think the first season was 16 episodes, and that was after Gone Home came out. Now the 2nd series is coming out now that Tacoma came out. And of course, I worked with Steve on Tacoma, so you know that. There's also Idle Thumbs, which is not as frequent as it used to be. It used to be a weekly podcast. It's now once a month, because they have another podcast that they've been doing, which is more about pop culture, called Important If True. I don't personally listen to that, so I can't say one way or the other. Finally, for games, I would say Shall We Play a Game with Chris Sulentrop and, or as I like to call him, The Trop, and JJ Sutherland. Yes, listen to hear what Chris thinks, and then just bear what JJ thinks. But
wow.
We have a long history of me emailing them and giving JJ grief, so I'm sure he will take that if he ever hears this in the spirit in which it was intended, which is just sticking out my tongue a little bit. Okay, and then the other large class of stuff that I listen to is sort of culture and film, and I'll run through those quickly. The Slate Culture Gabfest once a week, never miss it. Film Spotting, its whole family of podcasts are very good. Film Spotting, Streaming Video Unit, which is about streaming shows, and the Next Picture Show, which is every other week, 2 episodes that do an old movie rather, paired with a new release to talk about the context in which films come out. And then finally, a podcast from, I think, Maximum Fun, hosted by April Wolf of the LA Weekly, formerly of the LA Weekly, I think, called Switchblade Sisters, in which she talks about genre films with women in film, women directors, writers, producers, actresses, etc. Really an interesting show. And of course, as you mentioned, I actually listen to Kotaku Split Screen every week as well, but I didn't think that needed to be mentioned again. Yeah, so those are the things I can sort of flipping through immediately leap out. I hope some of those are interesting and or helpful to you. Thank you for the email, Ryan. Mm-hmm. And of course, Ryan sent that in, as I mentioned before, to devgameclub@gmail.com. I guess the last thing to talk about before we move on is our next set of stuff for God of War. We're going to play through the 3 challenges, the challenges of Atlas, Poseidon, and Hades. I believe those are sequential, and then we'll break once we're through the 3 of those, whatever the next save point is after that. There's generally plenty of saves. So we'll leave a small amount left at the end to play, just a few levels. We're going to try to do this game in 3 weeks. So we're doing kind of bigger chunks, but they're not super long to play. I will hopefully stream that this weekend, and I'll probably just start over so people can see the beginning of the game if they haven't, and I'll just go from there, because why not? So you can find me on Twitch at twitch.tv/Brett Douville with no underscore in between. I think that's about it for this week. So thanks so much for joining us. You can find me on Twitter at Brett_Douville and him at
Tim Longo Jr. with the JR at the end.
And an at the beginning. And of course, you can find the podcast at DevGameClub or at devgameclub.com on the web. Thanks so much for listening, and good night.
Good night.